Very interesting. So as you can see, I am today presenting you the effects of virtual environment transition techniques on presence, illusion of virtual body ownership, efficiency, and naturalness. I did this at the Chair of Human-Computer Interaction at the University of Würzburg with my colleague Martin. And what actually are transition techniques? Well, as we just saw in Joseph's work, we can have locomotion techniques for travel in the near vicinity, so we can travel over a short distance, like with teleportation, real walking, or we can have redirected walking. So we have multiple ideas how we can transition or navigate in the vicinity of our current position. However, when we want to change to a completely different environment, then there should be a video running, which is not running. Then there's the question, how actually can we do this? When we are here inside of this specific room and suddenly we are in a forest, this would be highly distracting for us because we are not used to it as human beings to suddenly be in a completely different environment. So we need something that allows us to transition from one place to a different place. And we are now using those transition techniques in scientific experiments. For instance, if we do have an acclimatization room and people get accustomed to the VR experience, they are not really used to it, they have to warm up, and then they are brought to the stimulus environment where they are maybe seeing a virtual mirror or where they see a certain task they have to complete. So there can be an effect of, some kind of confound. Also, we are also using it in computer games or serious applications. If you do have maybe a therapy application and you want to therapy a certain stroke patient or so, then this one also has to get acclimatized to the VR environment before starting with the therapy. And this makes transition techniques super valuable. The question is, does the realization of a virtual environment transition technique have an effect on the HMD VR experience? So we want to know in particular, has it an effect on the experience presence and illusion of virtual body ownership? Also, we wanted to know, is there a difference in the efficiency as well as naturalness? And this makes our research highly important for scientific research as well as for development of serious applications. As I just introduced you, we are using some acclimatization rooms to prepare our participants, and in the end, if there's a confound just because of this transition from one environment to the different environment, it would be not good. It would be pretty critical for our results we get. And let's talk a little bit about transition technique itself. We have found three important categories or three elements they are made of. On the one hand, it's the interaction type. It can be either physical or artificial. And by this, I mean, artificial is just pressing a button. So if you do have your Vive controller, you press a button on it and you do the transition, then it's an artificial element. Physical would mean you can grab an object and you can pull it around, or you can use your own body as with real walking or so. And of course, there are also mixed versions. For instance, you press a button and afterwards you have to do something with your body. The next up is the motion type. It can be continuous or non-continuous. With continuous, we just saw this in Joseph's example with his teleportation, that there was this slight transition as he was at first standing in the first place, then he was in the new place, and we saw this warp basically. So there we had some kind of continuity, whereas non-continuous would be just teleportating and then you're in the new environment without any continuous travel. The last thing is the diegesis. This is if the elements, the user interface elements, are implemented inside of the virtual environment or if they are not a part of it. So if you just have a layer on top of your virtual virtual environment, like a heads-up display, but it's not really implemented like a helmet or so, it's just a fixed layer in your vision, then this is basically a non-diegetic element because it's not part of the environment itself. If you would have something like the Vive controllers, you really see they are part in the environment, this is a diegetic element. Related work. This is just a brief summary, so if you want to know more details about it, please refer to the paper. we found that physical should be better than artificial, continuous should be better than non-continuous, and diegetic should be better than non-diegetic in respect to the experience presence, illusion of virtual body ownership, naturalness, and cyber sickness. For the last part, the diegetic versus non-diegetic, we decided we just look at diegetic elements because for HMD VR experience, you always have your controller, so they're always a part of the virtual environment. So having it non-diegetic wouldn't have made so much sense to us, so we excluded this. We mainly focused on the first two elements, so the physical and artificial and continuous, non-continuous. To define our transition techniques we wanted to analyze, we came up with simulated blink. This is an artificial non-continuous metaphor. I will just show you what this means. We have turnaround. There we have a mixed version, so we have some just a button press, but also some body movement. In this case, it's a full body movement, and it's continuous. And finally, we came up with a virtual head-mounted display, which is physical and continuous. So now we still see no videos, which is highly confusing because they were running as I tested it. Let me just try one last thing. Okay, so simulated blink. Here the user presses a button and is teleported into the new environment. And here we really see what I meant by a transition technique. So the user just presses a button, is in one environment, and immediately afterwards is teleported into a new environment. And we made it very distinct with this more bluish environment and this more pink environment to really make it obvious to the participant, all right, there was something going on, you just changed the environment. Simulated blink, as you just see, represents some kind of blink of an eye, so it fades to black for 1 second, and then you wake up into the new environment, and you initiate it just with a button press. The next up, turn around, the user presses a button, and then the environment behind the user gets exchanged, and by turning around by 180 degrees, the transition is complete, and when then the user looks around, he's completely in the new environment. The same thing works the other way around, so by pressing the button again and then turning around by 180 degrees, the transition is complete and the user can change between two individual virtual environments. Which makes it super interesting and also quite novel to just try out, okay, I can turn around and suddenly I'm in a new environment. The last metaphor we came up with was a virtual head-mounted display. So this thing is just hanging down from the ceiling. You can grab it, and by putting it on like a normal glass, you can transition into the world. And of course, vice versa, by reversing this gesture, you can return. So it was really like, okay, I grab this thing, put it on, and by doing the inverse gesture, I can return back to the initial virtual environment. And now the big question was, is there an effect or is there no effect? Does it influence the VR experience? And we came up with 4 hypotheses. The first one is, based on the literature review we did, the virtual head-mounted display and turnaround achieve a higher presence. The next one is the illusion of virtual body ownership is higher with the virtual head-mounted display and turnaround in contrast to the simulated blink all the time, of course. Finally, efficiency, just by the fact that, okay, button press and simulated blink, you press a button, you are in the new environment, is probably way more efficient than first grabbing an HMD, putting it on and removing it or turn around. So we just expected that the efficiency is not as good as with the simulated blink. And finally, the naturalness is higher when you use those physical and continuous transition techniques in contrast to the simulated blink, which is non-continuous and just artificial. How have we done this? Well, we did an experimental task. You already basically saw the experimental task. We had the first room, we called it the acclimatization room, as it's normally called in other experiments. It was designed a little bit similar to the office where we did the experiment. So we see a mirror, we had columns, we had the drawers. Everything was in the same place as in the real world to make the experience a little bit easier for the participants when they immerse themselves for the first time in the virtual environment. And we had those 2 cubes, a red cube and a blue cube. And those cubes were super important because when transitioning into the pink environment, there were 3 spheres, and by touching those spheres, they changed color to either blue or red. And as there were 3 spheres, one color was all the time in higher abundance. And so the main task for the participants was transition to the pink environment, touch all those 3 spheres, find out which is the color in higher abundance, return to the initial environment, and then select the color with those 2 input cubes to say, okay, this is now the correct color, and then they had to do it 7 times in a row so that we had this exposure to the transition technique several times and that they can hopefully judge it well if it's good or not good. All right. How does it look like? So user transitions to the new environment and looks around, and okay, we had sped it up. He touches all the balls, returns back, and selects the color. And this was done for all the various transition techniques. Now for the virtual body condition, we came up with 2 different ideas of representing the user inside of the virtual environment. The first one, on the left-hand side, we just showed the control devices. So we showed the Vive controllers as well as some feed trackers. We used those additional Vive trackers, as you can see in this real-world image of myself trying out our experiment. We had those overshoe things where we installed the Vive trackers because we used inverse kinematic for the full virtual body condition, which is symbolized with the wooden mannequin. And yeah, so to just keep things the same for both conditions, all of the participants had to wear the same setup, so all had to wear the belt, all had to wear those shoe overlayers. And the only difference was really how they were represented inside of the virtual environment. The study design then is a mixed design, so participants were either assigned to the full virtual body condition or the minimal virtual body condition, and then they had to do this experimental task I just presented to you and use all of the different transition techniques. Of course, for our evaluation, we mixed them up so they appeared in random order. It was not that they all the time started with simulated blink, turnaround, and virtual HMD, but yeah, it was just in random order. And after each experimental task, they were evaluating our transition technique. For this purpose, we asked the presence questionnaire afterwards. We did a mid-immersion presence assessment after the forced transition, so directly in the middle of the completion of the task. We used the alpha illusion virtual body ownership questionnaire to assess the effect of the virtual body ownership. For efficiency, we measured the completion time for the task, as well as used the NASA-TLX to determine the task load. And naturalness, as naturalness also is a little bit dependent on the intuitivity. So things are really natural when we can understand them without really thinking about them. So we measured the intuitive use of each transition technique using the quasi, and we asked for the preference as well as the reasoning why the transition technique is good or bad. For our results, we had 49 participants, 33 females, 16 males. They had a mean age of 21 years. We had 15 frequent computer game players. There we asked them before we assigned them to a group, are you a frequent computer game player or not? Because during the pre-test we found out that computer game players reacted differently to the transition techniques than non-computer game players, as they were more used to it. And so we made sure that they were equally distributed between the 2 groups, so between the full virtual body condition and the minimal virtual body condition. 40 of them have used an HMD before. We also measured the simulator sickness, but we found no differences between the 2 times of measurement, and we found no differences between the 2 virtual body conditions, so that's good. Our simulation was running flawlessly, and the transition techniques had apparently no effect no matter which one we used. For presence, we only found a difference using the presence questionnaire between the simulated blink and the turn metaphor, and only for the minimal virtual body condition. We found no significant differences between the two conditions for the other techniques, nor did we found a difference using the mid-immersion presence assessment between the different tested transition techniques as well as between the two virtual body conditions. So we all the time tested between all the inside each group and between each group to see if there's a difference or a moderation caused by the virtual body. So for the hypothesis, we had to reject our presence hypothesis because the tested transition techniques had only a limited effect on the experienced presence. As I just showed you, there was only one effect in the minimal virtual body condition, and the degree of the virtual body had only a limited effect on the presence. Why? I will explain you in a bit, because we are now coming to the illusion of virtual body ownership. We found no effect or no difference between the transition techniques again on the experienced illusion of virtual body ownership. However, we found a significantly higher acceptance subcategory rating in the minimal virtual body condition, which was at first quite surprising to us because we thought, hey, you have this whole body, you have the wooden mannequin as your body. This should be better, this should be more interesting for you. But yeah, we came up with an explanation as we rejected our hypothesis that it might have been an effect of game flow. Our task was a little bit too much like a game, so they were really required, okay, transition between two environments, touch the spheres, and put in the correct color, which also gave them a positive or negative feedback if they were correct or wrong. And so it might have been that we accidentally caused some game flow, and the game flow could be stronger than the experience of illusion of virtual body ownership. This, of course, is still in discussion, highly debatable. The other idea would be that it might have been an experience of an uncanny valley effect. So just because we used the wooden mannequin, it might have been not as interesting or not as believable as just seeing the normal controllers, which they also had in the real world. So maybe this was the reason why the acceptance rating was higher in the minimal virtual body condition. But no matter what the effects of virtual body were, in the end, the tested transition techniques had no effect on the ratings of the illusion of body ownership. So this was pretty good because it gave us the confirmation you can use all those transition techniques and still do your experiments trying to find out if illusion of virtual body ownership is better or not, and you are not confounding your experiments. For the task load, the NASA task load goes from 0 to 100. So as you can see, we were all in the lower 1/3 of the measurement for all of the transition techniques. Still, we found a significant difference between the simulated blink and the turnaround, as well as simulated blink and virtual head-mounted display for both conditions. So for the full virtual body and the minimal virtual body. This, of course, is not really a surprise because, as you just saw in the demonstration videos, for a simulated blink, they really had just to press a button. No physical actions were involved, whereas for turnaround, they really had to turn around, and for grabbing the HMD, they had to grab the HMD, so there were more physical actions involved. There were no differences between the virtual body conditions, of course, again. For completion time, also not really surprising. The simulated blink, we have just had to press a button, is of course faster than stretching your arm out, putting on the virtual glasses and removing them or turning around. And again, no differences between the two virtual body conditions. For the discussion, this confirmed our hypothesis. So they were slower, they caused a higher task load, which I just explained because they required more additional actions. However, when we look back at the overall task load, it's still very low. So even if you are using those physical metaphors, the task load itself was relatively low, which means it's not bad. There's, of course, a difference. We measured it, but it's still in a frame where it's still usable for game development if you want to make things maybe a little bit more interesting. Finally, naturalness. Here you can also see the queasy questionnaire goes up to 5, so it's a 1 to 5 Likert scale, and all the transition techniques had a rating of almost 4, and well, we found significant difference occurs again between simulated blink and the two other transition techniques. But when we just look at the data itself, it still shows that it was intuitive, so it was not completely difficult for the users to understand what we did. Nevertheless, their statistical analysis revealed a significant difference between simulated blink and the other two transition techniques for both conditions, but we found no moderation of the virtual body itself. For the preference, 20 votes for the simulated blink with an explanation for it's easy to use, it's very efficient, so you just press a button and you're in the new environment. The virtual head-mounted display received 18 votes. The participants praised the high degree of self-control because you can easily grab it, you slowly immerse yourself into the new environment, high naturalness as well as believability, and turnaround, 11 votes, very dynamic, high naturalness, also pretty cool. We confirmed our naturalness hypothesis with that, and of course, significantly higher intuitive use for blink, but this might have been influenced by an habituation effect. We see this metaphor everywhere, and so we just thought, okay, this could be an explanation why there's a difference. Takeaway is presence and illusion of virtual body ownership are not affected by the transition techniques. Efficiency was correct. Naturalness is still higher with our physical as well as continuous forms. In conclusion, transition techniques, at least the three we tested, are interchangeable, at least for the experience presence and illusion of virtual body ownership if you want to do experiments. And the continuous and physical forms were perceived more natural, more believable, which can be design guidelines for scientists as well as designers. This also brings us to the future work. We just did an experiment for the presence, but the plausibility illusion, if the virtual environment or if the effects and events happening in the virtual environment are perceived as more real and more believable, we haven't tested for that. So this could be also interesting if the transition techniques have an effect on the plausibility illusion. Also interesting would be a nested VR experience, so transitioning into multiple layers of virtual environments. So putting on the glasses to get into the first, putting on there another glass to get in the third layer. Could be interesting to see if this transitioning into maybe a rabbit hole, as we would call it, could be interesting. And finally, our categorization would be interesting to expand it a little bit with our data we just gathered to get a comprehensive taxonomy and to develop some design guidelines. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed it.
So, thanks, Sebastian. Are there any questions?
So the turnaround is interesting, but it's limited in a sense to two environments. Because you can only turn around once, basically. Unless you transition. So what's your thoughts on that?
Do you mean, well, this is a little bit different or difficult. I mean, for this nested VR experience, you can, of course, yeah, for the nested VR experience, it's indeed very complicated. So you might need to have an additional way of selecting the target virtual environment, because when you just say, okay, we want to turn around and we just do it between two individual environments, and there's no way to really decide where you want to go. So you need probably to have a different interface. So this is maybe a flaw for our future work, but yeah, I mean, we would still come up hopefully with an idea how we can add some additional mechanic to make this transition still useful for multiple layers.
Well, I mean, you can use like different angles and provide different, then you make like a forward motion, for example, to get
Yeah, sure. I mean, there would be some ideas what we can do.
Are there any other questions?
When you were introducing your problem, I was thinking that I think in real life we're actually kind of, there are two situations where you're actually used to seeing a completely new environment. One, you already used with your blink metaphor, which is when you watch movies, you always get cuts to a new scene, and you're essentially transported instantly to a new place, and people seem to be okay with that. My thoughts there was, maybe that's because usually the scene doesn't just put you into your first person view, but it actually kind of introduces you to where you are, maybe does a fly through or approaches your area slowly. So one thing I'd be interested in is whether if you looked at transitions, maybe camera flights or something to introduce the person to the new scene that they're being transported into rather than putting them on the spot.
To the first thing of introducing our problem, we also thought about it, but when you just watch a movie, it's a 2D element in front of you most of the time, whereas in the virtual environment, you're completely surrounded. So it would be really if you're standing here and you're suddenly in a forest. I mean, this is, I guess, still a different experience. We haven't tested it, so it was just our wild guess that it might be completely disturbing if it would happen in an instant. Towards the slowly approach to the new position, we haven't done it, we haven't tried it, we haven't even thought about it, or we thought about it, but because there's a continuous motion, and I mean even for travel in the near vicinity, when you have some kind of sitting on a car or being just moved without having your own control, it's easily causing a high degree of simulator sickness. And so we haven't really thought about it because we don't want it to get our participants sick and in the end having some problems with cleaning the floor in the end or so. So we haven't really tried it because we just don't want it to have simulator sickness caused.
Maybe one quick follow-up. The other situation in which I think we're often entering new environments that are radically different is doors.
Yeah.
So I guess my simple question is, what's wrong with doors?
Nothing is wrong with doors. Doors are completely fine, but you need doors.
That's great. Yeah.
I mean, there are also multiple experiments where they actually had a real door and participants were able to see this door in the virtual environment. They could just really press down the door handle, open the door and move through it. And if it's no door there, so if no real door is there, they have nothing to grab. So they would need to grab something, open that door and move through it. And then there's the next problem. Depending on your environment, where you have your VR set up, if I would have the door here, the virtual environment door here, I would open up and I like to move out, then there's something in my way. So it would make things way more inflexible when you really have a virtual door, because you need to take into account the real space, so the real environment where the VR setup is built, because this could cause some issues. And so
I can clearly see that you'd have to move maybe at least a little to step through the door. On the other hand, I thought it was kind of funny, like hanging a virtual HMD in front of the person when they're wearing an HMD. It was kind of interesting, recursive. And 40 of your users had experience with wearing HMDs already, so that was maybe not exactly like an average population from off the market. I'm just wondering whether the metaphor of walking through a door, even if it's just as virtual as your HMD was, because my understanding is they weren't putting on another physical HMD, right? They were just doing this in the virtual world. So it's just as virtual as that door that you would render. Yeah. And if you open that and make a step forward, maybe that's something that a broader range of users might feel comfortable. And you would have the same kind of preview of looking around, seeing the virtual space behind the door, the new environment behind the door. So just a suggestion.
Sure. I mean, there are, I guess, plenty of ideas how you can do it. Another idea we came up with would be some kind of elevator metaphor where you just get into a room, the door closes, the elevator moves up, opens again, and you don't really see it. You're just inside this elevator environment, and as soon as the door opens again, you can be in a completely different environment. And this would be also a different way how you can come up with a transition with